Hi there, this is Matt McManus. I'm a professor of politics and international relations at Tech de Monterey, and I'm here to talk about our upcoming Zer0 book, What is Postmodern Conservatism? Essays on Our Hugely Tremendous Time, which I co-authored with David Hollins, Dylan DeJong, Eric Tate, Conrad Hamilton, and Warner Radnick. So our book takes a look at the rise of things like Trumpism, Orbanism in Europe, but it does throw through a bit of a more theoretical lens. And our essays deal with different aspects of postmodern society and how it engendered the rise of new forms of conservatism. And we're hoping it'll be of interest to anyone who's been paying attention to politics recently and is interested in a bit more of a big picture look at some of these subject matters. So to understand what postmodern conservatism is, we first have a pretty good grip on what postmodernism itself is, which will help us understand why it is that I decided to use the label when referring to these new brands of conservatism. And part of the problem with this is that postmodernism is a very politicized term in and of itself right now. It means a lot of different things to many different people. So we all know that for a lot of conservatives, people like Jordan Peterson or Stephen Hicks, postmodernism refers to a kind of new kind of Marxism, which has emerged in the latter half of the 20th century, and which is basically designed to re-articulate old-fashioned and outdated Marxist points using a new and even more dangerous kind of language. And then there are people who understand postmodernism more as a philosophical position. You can think of people like Spivak or Jacques Derrida or Michel Foucault, who understand postmodernism as problematizing narratives about universal truths, putting it really simply. Now, this doesn't mean, qua the kind of stereotype that any of these figures was opposed to the notion of universal truth generally, just that they attack different ways that had been understood up to this point, or at least tried to show how they rested upon a more problematic foundation than other people might have been willing to recognize. So those are both interesting ways of understanding postmodernism, but the one that we really rely on in our book is the kind of approach that was developed by people like David Harvey, Mark Fisher, who was one of the founders of Zer0 Books, Jean-François Lyotard, who approached postmodernism as a condition in modernity, or as Frederick Jameson might call it, a culture, which is the term that I personally like to use and what I use most often in the book. So approaching postmodernism as a culture means understanding it as something more than just a way that Marxists are trying to convince people to join emancipatory movements using a new language, or just a philosophical trope that kind of brushes up skepticism for a new era. It means understanding that the kind of world and society that we inhabit right now differs in some important respects from the one that our predecessors might have inhabited. And this is kind of what Harvey and Jameson and Fisher will deal with in their respective works. And in our book, we treat postmodernism as the culmination of several trends that have been going on for a very long time in developed societies, and that peaked with the rise of neoliberalism, particularly in the 1980s. So in postmodern culture, our sense of time and space as linear and predictable becomes highly troubled. We once had this feeling that history was moving in a clear direction, and there would always be new things for us to do and new challenges for us to face. But one of the ways in which our sense of time changed under postmodernity is the sense that history had kind of come to an end. This is the famous Francis Fukuyama thesis. And as Mark Fisher and others have observed, this wasn't necessarily intended as a triumphant realization. This idea that history came to an end left a lot of people feeling that, well, what is it I'm supposed to do with my life? How is it that I'm going to get the kind of recognition out of politics and out of political participation that I really truly crave deep down? Another way in which postmodernity differed from earlier periods in history was the real challenges it imposed on our sense of identity. So if you think about something like the medieval period prior to the advent of secularism, it might not have been a very free time, but nonetheless, you could at least sense that many people had a good idea of who they were and what they were intending to do. Whereas within neoliberal contexts, for a wide variety of reasons, which include market disruption of traditional forms of life, the advent of liberal ideas about agency, this sense of who we are and what we are intended to do became a lot more troubled. And Zizek has talked a great deal about this, how one of the great perils of freedism is the sense of not knowing what it is that we're supposed to do. And this can trigger a great deal of anxiety on the part of many people. And this is certainly what we are going to claim happened in the neoliberal context to abet the rise of things like postmodern conservatism. I think that postmodern conservatism is the kind of right-wing politics that you see gradually start to coalesce in the condition of postmodernity or in postmodern culture. And we already saw variants of postmodern leftism emerge under the labels of things like identity politics, a lot of that stuff that people tend to criticize, not always in the most robust manner. And it was inevitable that there was going to be a kind of dialectical reaction to these kind of politics as we saw their right-wing twin start to emerge. And that's the simplest way of understanding postmodern conservatism, is the kind of right-wing politics you see in a postmodern culture. But it has roots that go back considerably further than just the contemporary era. At least I'll argue in a few of the essays. So for instance, I point out that the kind of problem of identity and history that you see in postmodern culture was already anticipated and dealt with by several canonical conservative figures in the tradition, probably the most prominent of whom is Joseph de Maistre, the famous critic of the French Revolution, who argued that liberal rationalism and the rise of these kind of new technologies and ways of thinking challenged the traditional bases of authority. And what we needed was an almost irrational drive, regardless of whether or not this could be proven, to restore our older sense of identity and of political authority. So postmodern conservatism is characterized by a number of different traits, and we talk about them all in the book at some length. But one of the ones that I'd like to highlight today, and one of the ones that I focus on in my own essays for the text, is the kind of way postmodern conservatives try to deal with this problem of identity experienced within postmodernity by establishing what I call a pastiche of different identities and try to coalesce them all into one that can be mobilized for political purposes. So what do I mean by this? Well, what postmodern conservatives tend to do is they react to the sense that they don't know who they are by looking to the past and trying to find historically powerful or prominent identities that they can then rearrange in their minds into a new kind of identity, a pastiche of these older ones, that they can then put forward as the group that's actually supposed to be in charge. And this can take a lot of different forms. Some postmodernist conservatives will appeal to the concept of Western civilization as the identity to which they belong. Sometimes they'll appeal to Christendom and older religious traditions as the identity to which they belong. In more darker variants of postmodern conservatism, we see them appeal to things like ethnic identity and sometimes even racial identity. So, I belong to the white American race, which is under attack right now. And at points, postmodern conservatives might even conflate all of these together, right? So I belong to a Western civilization that was once characterized by white Anglo-Saxon Christians being in charge, and I'm really concerned about that falling apart. And I feel that we need a strong man who's going to re-entrench our authority against all these different groups that are trying to inhibit or break down the natural order of things. And this is the other characteristic of postmodern conservatism that we emphasize in the book. There's a weird paradox at the center of this way of thinking about things, where postmodern conservatives will almost invariably try to naturalize the authority of the pastiche-like identity that they appeal to by saying that, well, this group is superior in some way, shape, or form. Western civilization, as we understand it at least, is superior to its competitors. Christendom is a more robust and theologically convincing religion than, for instance, Islam, certainly. And some will even go and say Judaism, etc., etc. Being white is just naturally superior to belonging to another ethnic or racial group. But the weird tension in this is, of course, that despite being superior in this way, the postmodern conservative also sees this group or identity that they affiliate with as being under attack and losing the authority that it deserves to have. And this is where you see a lot of the attacks on these very ambiguously defined groups, whether they be leftists or immigrants or media elites and so on, come in. And it's foundational to the postmodern conservative worldview that we belong to this identity that's superior in some way, shape, or form to others, but nonetheless, its authority is being undermined by all these enemies that are simultaneously lesser than the postmodern conservative, but also wield a great deal more power and have a great deal more influence in society today. And this leads postmodern conservatives to gravitate towards strong men, it's almost invariably men, who promise to restore the identity or pastiche of identities that they associate with to their rightful place atop of the political hierarchy. And it's what you've seen right now with the rise of figures like Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on and so forth. All of them claim that this identity that was once in charge and was rightfully in charge is now being undermined by this coalition of leftists, media elites, immigrants, refugees, environmentalists, feminists, you name it. And what they're going to do is restore the authority and prestige of this group through political force, if necessary. So that's what our book is about, and we really hope that you enjoy it when it comes out later this year. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bing, bing, bong, bong. Bing, 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 bong. How can you not love China?
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.